Is there a difference between intellectually knowing free will is an illusion and
Yeah.
really experiencing it?
Yeah.
What's the longest you've been able to experience the escape the illusion of free will?
Well, it's always it's always obvious to me when I pay attention. I mean, whenever I'm mindful, this is the term of jargon, in the Buddhist and increasingly, outside the Buddhist context is mindfulness, right? But there are sort of different levels of mindfulness, and there's different degrees of insight into this. But yes, I mean, what I'm calling evidence of lack of free will and lack of the self, I mean, like two sides of the same coin. There's a sense of being a subject in the middle of experience to whom all experience refers,
Mm-hmm.
the sense of I, the sense of me. And that's almost everybody's starting point when they start to meditate. And that's almost always the place people live most of their lives from. I do think that gets interrupted in ways that get unrecognized. I think people are constantly losing the sense of I. They're losing the sense of subject-object distance, but they're not recognizing it. And meditation is the mode in which you can recognize. You can both consciously precipitate it. You can look for the self and fail to find it, and then recognize its absence. And that's just the flip side of the coin of free will. I mean, the feeling of having free will is what it feels like to feel like a self who's thinking his thoughts and doing his actions and intending his intentions. And the man in the middle of the boat who's rowing, that's the start. That's the false starting point. When you find that there's no one in the middle of the boat, right? Or in fact, there's no boat. There's just the river. There's just the flow of experience, and there's no center to it, and there's no place from which you would control it. Again, even when you're doing things, this does not negate the difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior. It's like I can voluntarily reach for this, but when I'm paying attention, I'm aware that everything is just happening. Like just the intention to move is just arising, right? And I'm in no position to know why it didn't arise a moment before or a moment later or a moment or 50% stronger or weaker, or so as to be ineffective or to be doubly effective, sort of where I lurched for it versus I moved slow. I mean, I can never run the counterfactuals. I can never. I mean, all of this opens the door to an even more disconcerting picture along the same lines, which is subsumes this conversation about free will, and it's the question of whether anything is ever possible. Like, what if, this is a question I haven't thought a lot about it, but it's been a few years I've been kicking this question around. So, I mean, what if only the actual is possible? What if there was, so we live with this feeling of possibility. We live with the sense that, I have two daughters. I could have had a third child, right? So what does it mean to say that I could have had a third child? Or you don't have kids, I don't think.
No.
So
Not that I know of.
yes. So
but the possibility might be
right.
there.
So what do we mean when we say you could have had a child, or you might have a child in the future? Like what is the space in reality? What's the relationship between possibility and actuality and reality? Is there a reality in which non-actual things are nonetheless real? And so we have other categories of like non-concrete things. We have things that don't have spatial, temporal dimension, but they're nonetheless they nonetheless exist. So like in the integers, right? So numbers. There's a reality. There's an abstract reality to numbers, and it's philosophically interesting to think about these things. So they're not like, in some sense, they're real, and they're not merely invented by us. They're discovered because they have structure that we can't impose upon them. Right? It's not like they're not fictional characters. Like I mean, Hamlet and Superman also exist in some sense, but they exist at the level of our own fiction and abstraction. But it's like There are true and false statements you can make about Hamlet. There are true and false statements you can make about Superman, because our fiction, the fictional worlds we've created, have a certain kind of structure. But again, this is all abstract. It's all abstractable from any of its concrete instantiations. It's not just in the comic books and just in the movies. It's in our, ongoing ideas about these characters. But natural numbers or the integers don't function quite that way. I mean, they're similar, but they also have a structure that's purely a matter of discovery. It's not, you can't just make up whether numbers are prime. If you give me two integers, of a certain size, let's say you mentioned two enormous integers. If I were to say, okay, well, between those two integers, there are exactly 11 prime numbers, right? That's a very specific claim about which I can be right or wrong. And whether or not anyone knows I'm right or wrong. It's like, there's a domain of facts there, but these are abstract. It's an abstract reality that relates in some way that's philosophically interesting, metaphysically interesting to what we call real reality, the spatial temporal order, the physics of things. But possibility, at least in my view, occupies a different space. And this is something, again, my thoughts on this are pretty inchoate, and I think I need to talk to a philosopher of physics and or a physicist about how this may interact with things like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
So that's an interesting, right, exactly. Right. So I wonder if discoveries in physics, like further proof or more concrete proof that many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics has some validity,
right?
If that completely starts to change things.
But even that's just more actuality. So if I took that seriously,
sure.
that's a case of, and truth is that happens even if the many worlds interpretation isn't true, but we just imagine we have a physically infinite universe. The implication of infinity is such that things will begin to repeat themselves. Yeah. The farther you go in space, right? So, if you just head out in one direction, eventually you're going to meet two people just like us having a conversation just like this, and you're going to meet them an infinite number of times in every, infinite variety of permutations, slightly different from this conversation, right? So, I mean, infinity is just so big that our intuitions of probability completely break down. But what I'm suggesting is maybe probability isn't a thing, right? Maybe there's only actuality. Maybe there's only what happens. And at every point along the way, our notion of what could have happened or what might have happened is just that. It's just a thought about what could have happened or might have happened.
So it's a fundamentally different thing. If you can imagine a thing, that doesn't make it real. So because that's where that possibility exists. It's in your imagination, right?
And possibility itself is a kind of spooky idea because it too has a sort of structure, right? So like if I'm going to say, you could have had a daughter, right, last year. So we're saying that's possible, but not actual, right? That is a claim. There are things that are true and not true about that daughter, right? Like it has a kind of structure. It's like,
I feel like there's a lot of fog around the possibility. It feels like almost like a useful narrative.
But what does it mean? So like, what does it mean if we say, I just did that, but it's conceivable that I wouldn't have done that, right? Like it's possible that I just threw this cap, but right. I might not have done that.
So right? You're taking it very temporally close to the original, like what would appear as a decision.
Whenever we're saying something's possible, but not actual, right? Like this thing just happened, but it's possible that it wouldn't have happened or that it would have happened differently. In what does that possibility consist? Like, where is that? For that to be real, for the possibility to be real, what claim are we making about the universe?
Well, isn't that an extension of the idea that free will is an illusion, that all we have is actuality, that the possibility is an illusion?
Right. I'm just extending it beyond human action. Like okay. This goes to the physics of things. This is just everything. Like we're always telling ourselves a story that includes possibility.
Possibility is really compelling for some reason.
Well, yeah, because it's. I mean, so this, yeah, I mean, this could sound just academic, but every backward-looking regret or disappointment and every forward-looking worry is completely dependent on this notion of possibility. Like every regret is based on the sense that something else, I could have done something else. Something else could have happened. Every disposition to worry about the future is based on the feeling that there's this range of possibilities. It could go either way. And, you know, I mean, I know whether or not there's such a thing as possibility, you know, I'm convinced that worry is almost never psychologically appropriate, because the reality is that in any given moment, either you can do something to solve the problem you're worried about or not. So if you can do something, just do it, you know, and if you can't, your worrying is just causing you to suffer twice over, right? You're going to, you know, you're going to get the medical procedure next week anyway. How much time between now and next week do you want to spend worrying about it, right? It's the worry doesn't accomplish anything.